Hello and welcome, everyone, to the Museum of Jewish Heritage, a living memorial to the Holocaust. I'm Grace Rooney. I'm an intern in the Marketing and Public Programming Department at the museum, and I'm pleased to welcome you all today to our inaugural New York Jewish Book Festival. This event is on Dressmakers of Prospect Heights with Kitty Zeldis and Bonnie Friedman. We also hope that you'll explore the 32 events happening throughout the museum today, meet some of our 85 speakers, and get books signed at one of our 72 author signings in our main lobby and events hall on the second floor. While you're here, we also encourage you to take your time to visit our exhibitions, The Holocaust, What He Can Do on the main level, and Survivors, Faces of Life After the Holocaust, photographs by Martin Scholler on the third floor. Andy Goldsworth, Garden of Stones, is also worth a visit just outside of our wonderful cafe Locks, and the whole museum is open to you today. You can also pick up holiday gifts and books in our Pickman Museum shop and visitor services on the main level. We encourage people to wear masks in the museum, and we hope you'll share your feedback with us from this event in an email survey, which you will receive tomorrow. This program is made possible in part by support from the Battery Park City Authority and from your donations, so thank you. And now I'm glad to introduce you to our speakers. Kitty Zeldis is the pseudonym for an award-winning author of 9 novels and over 35 books for children. Her essays, articles, and short fiction have been published in many national and literary publications, and she is also the fiction editor of Lillith magazine. And Bonnie Friedman is the author of best-selling Writing Past Dark, Envy, Fear, Distraction, and Other Dilemmas in the Writer's Life, which has been widely anthologized. Her most recent book is Surrendering Oz, A Life in Essays, and her essay have been included in the Best American Movie Writing, the Best Buddhist Writing, the Best of O, Oprah Magazine, and the Best Writing on Writing. The Dressmaker of Prospect Heights is available for purchase in our museum shop, and Kitty will sign copies for half an hour after the event in our resource area on the second floor of the museum. And so, without further ado, please welcome Kitty Zeldis and Bonnie Friedman.
So thank you, everybody, for coming out. Just as I was arriving, it started to snow. It seems like the first snow of the season. It seems like it's cleared up a little bit now, but I just so appreciate people turning out for a book event. Isn't this great? And I'm going to just start by asking Kitty to talk about the genesis. Where did you get the idea for this novel?
Is this on? It's on. Just let me second my thanks to Bonnie for stepping in at the last minute. Somebody else was scheduled to do this and got COVID. And for all of you coming out, to really support the idea that books matter, and thinking about them and talking about them and reading them is of consequence. Writers without readers are no one. We are just talking to ourselves. So we are very grateful. I am very grateful for people who are still reading. So the Dressmakers of Prospect Heights started in New Orleans in the late 1980s. I didn't know that it was starting there. I went there with my husband, a photographer. We took a lot of road trips that were kind of dictated by his interests in photographing. And he'd been to New Orleans before, and he really loved it, and he wanted me to love it too. He was a little anxious that I would not, but he had nothing to worry about. I just fell in love with it. Have any of us been? So it is, I think, fair to say, a singular American city with its amalgam of French and Spanish and Cajun, and its music and its garden district and the French Quarter and streets named Terpsichore and Errato. Like, what is not to love? So after this wonderful trip there, I found that it was very much on my radar, and that I would, I'd see things about it, I'd want to read them, and I, was interested in learning more. So this was how I learned that from 1898 to 1917, prostitution was legal in New Orleans. And this was not because they had such an enlightened or progressive government a la Amsterdam. It was because prostitution was so deeply entrenched, so virulent, controlled by such hardened and vicious criminals, that the city fathers felt the only way they could control it was to legalize it. So that's exactly what they did. There was an alderman, Story, whose idea it was, and it was so these 38 designated blocks were called Storyville or the district. And in this area, you could function as a brothel or as an individual proprietor, sole proprietor, as a prostitute without any legal consequence at all. So needless to say, this was a kind of busy, active place, and it spanned the gamut from little shacks called cribs where you could hire somebody for 10 cents to fabulous, ornate brothels, very, very high end, one more spectacular than the next, along Basin Street. And as it happened, Basin Street was parallel to the train station. So you can imagine the visitor perhaps for the first time, coming, the train is pulling in. There's this row of beautiful mansions, all lit up, women in the windows trying to entice customers in various ways. And you'd get off the train and just be kind of overwhelmed, like where to go, what to do. So what the city decided to do was publish a directory of all the services available. And the brothels would advertise, so this was paid advertising, but even those who did not pay were listed individually. And I saw some of these books, and first they were sold, but very quickly they were given away at the train station or at newsstands. So you could get this as soon as you arrived. And there was an entry that read, Caucasian, 21, Jewish. And this was of great interest to me. Like, there were Jewish girls. A Jewish girl was a prostitute in New Orleans. I didn't know this story. And I was very curious about it, but not being a historian, being a novelist, I decided to write it. So that's what I did. That character kind of formed around that idea. And I thought about who she would be and what would have brought her there. And apart from women, and there were many who were coerced into prostitution, many of them chose it. Why? Why would one do that? So that's really where I began.
That's so interesting. Let me ask you a follow-up question about that. And you might not know the answer to this. How unusual was it for a Jewish woman to end up as a prostitute?
That I don't really know. I could not find, I looked into that, but I could not really find a lot of data to support it. But the fact that there was one was enough.
Yeah.
That was like, all you need is one.
That's true. Now, I know that you went down to New Orleans when you were preparing to write the book after all those years. And I'm wondering, are there things that you saw or heard that informed the way you wrote the city as it was? I think you are writing it in the 1920s.
Yes,
I'm just wondering,
exactly.
as a historical novelist, I'm always, to hear what is the research that you do and how do you bring that into the pages?
Right.
Because you're writing a novel that feels extremely contemporary. It doesn't feel, there's nothing sepia toned about it. It feels like contemporary present tense life, and yet it's set in that time. So how did that research work when you went down to New Orleans?
Well, I had the good fortune of having a friend who'd been to Tulane for law school, and she had a friend still living there who was then a retired lawyer who turned tour guide. So I got in touch with her and I told her what I was doing and what I was looking for, and she created a custom tour for me over a period of a couple of days so I could see things I wanted to see. However, those mansions along Basin Street are all gone. Not a one exists. A lot of photographs and other drawings and renderings, but they were all torn down. This was probably very conscious because as I said, in 1917, the legalized prostitution ended, and it ended because the United States got into the First World War, and New Orleans was a port city. So soldiers, sailors were, filing through, and it was just too much temptation for these boys. They would disappear, they would get drunk, they would get syphilis. So the federal government said, we have to stop this. There was some pushback on the local level because they had been doing it for quite a number of years and it was a big part of their economy. But in the end, the federal government won out and it was ended. Not that it went away, but it went underground. It was back to being criminal activity.
So you had to imagine those
I had to imagine
houses.
that. But the Garden District where, I write about that, and the Quarter, those things were still there and I could see them.
And you get some of the texture of the life still even now.
Yes, absolutely.
And the weather, because you bring that in, you make it very palpable, the sense, the smell, the feel.
The heat, the
heat,
humidity.
Right.
Particularly for someone who, this character whom I've imagined is a Russian Jewish young woman, and she's never encountered such heat before in her life. So it's really overpowering to her.
One of the things I wanted to talk about, this is to getting to a slightly darker part of the story, which, most of it isn't, but I think you do a really good job of conveying the anti-Semitism in the 1870s and 80s in Russia that impelled, immigrants to come here. And I feel, and also the mood of the 1920s, also a different kind of anti-Semitism. And that felt so different from the anti-Semitism that we're hearing about today. Mm-hmm. And I'm wondering if you could talk about that, what it was like to write those scenes that, I don't know if I should go into more detail, but maybe you would address that.
Okay. I imagine I am not alone in this room in having ancestry from Eastern Europe, and particularly in my well, actually both sides, but my maternal grandmother was from Russia, and her early life informed this. I always had to say early life because she was never a prostitute or a madam, and I don't think she ever set foot in New Orleans. But she was from, and I won't say too much because I don't want to give away, but her background was somewhat unusual for a Jewish family at that time. Her father was a tanner, a profession allowed to Jews because it was so revolting. Most people did not want to do it. Urine was a chief component in the tanning process. So this great-grandfather of mine was a rather wealthy man, and she described a house with parquet floors and velvet drapes and crystal chandeliers, and the older sisters, there were many of them. I think her mother must have been biblically fertile. There were 22 children in that family. Hard to imagine, right? Like doing that 22 times. The older sisters had dancing lessons and music lessons. The brothers went to a military academy. Jewish boys did not go to military academies in Russia, so his money must have been, somehow paved the way for that, and an exception could be made. And this life ended very abruptly and hideously, and I used that in my story. I don't want to say too much how that happened, but I used that in the imagining of this woman's early life. But that, what would drive people out, because I think we can all assume, and I'm sure most of us have some kind of immigration story. People didn't immigrate because they thought, oh, it'd be nice to live there. Like, wouldn't that be fun? Like, no, there was nothing left for you back where you were. And you were desperate to leave. And so you did.
Thank you. You know that the title of your book is The Dressmakers of Prospect Heights. And I was hoping, so two of the characters are phenomenal at designing clothing and at sewing. And I know that whenever you write about clothing, you write with such profound knowledge. And I'm just wondering if you could talk about how important clothing is, do you think, in the lives of the women in the book and in general, like what function it serves?
I think I do like it, and I do like to write about it. And I do think it's an important thing, not as window dressing, but I think for women, like dressing ourselves to present ourselves to the world is a really important thing. And we care about it a lot. It's a marker of social status, of our aspirations, of how we feel about ourselves. And it's like we're inventing ourselves every day. Like, how am I going to face the world today? And what you put on helps you do that. So I really like writing about it and having it be kind of integrated into their lives.
Did you ever study clothing design?
Oh God, no. I mean, I wish, but I like to say that I would want it to be like Martha Stewart. If I did it, it would look like Lucy and Ethel did it. I am just like not handy at all. I did take home ec in junior high school. I bet many of us did that. And actually through a series of ridiculous events, I won an award one year, like for the bet, because the other girls in my class were very ambitious, and they were making these like prom dresses or dresses to attend a brother's wedding, and they didn't finish them. I picked the simplest thing I could find, a skirt with 2 seams and a zipper. And I finished it. So I ended up with the highest grade simply because I finished. I was the only girl that finished. And then this is typical of New York City public schools. The following semester, term, the teacher went on leave, and the new teacher, the substitute teacher, didn't have a license to allow the girls to use the sewing machines. So there was no sewing. So I ended up with the award that year, which I did not deserve. But nevertheless.
You know what I wanted to talk to you about? You just bring up such an interesting point about the importance of completing something, because you are an amazingly prolific writer. And I always am astonished. You're always you deeply at work on something. There's always a next project and a project after that. This is not a question I planned to ask you, but I was wondering if you could talk about that, because when you say the importance of completion, I know so many of us who are writers get to be perfectionists, and we're tweaking, we're working on something. And that could become problematic. We're aware, readers are going to have opinions about it. So I don't know if you have any tips to give that are the secrets to your tremendous productivity and accomplishment.
Well, thank you. I have not had a day job since 1987, so I'd better be prolific, to keep myself afloat. I don't really know what to say about that. But I know what you're talking about, that there is a tendency to want to rewrite and perfect. And even sometimes when a book is published and I go back and read it, like if I'm reading aloud, I think I would change that word. Like I would, why did I use that word? Why didn't I change that? At a certain point, you just have to surrender it.
And don't you think with any piece of art or anything that's handmade, there are going to be flaws?
Yes.
So you can't wait until they're all gone because there's so many other stories you wouldn't have gotten to write.
That is true.
You know,
and there is
otherwise.
a proverb, I am told, among rug makers who say, only God is perfect. So every rug will have a flaw, like those beautiful rugs that we think of, from the Middle East. So I think, well, then yes, it's going to have a flaw or two.
That's really great. One of the passages in the novel that I so admire have to do with the state of mind of a woman who loses the child that she so wanted. She so wanted to give birth, and she finally gets pregnant, and she carries it to term, and it's a stillborn, and then she loses the ability to have children. And my favorite passages were where you were rendering this sort of slightly deranged state of mind of profound mourning. And I'm just wondering if you could talk about that. Those passages seemed very original to me, quite different. I'd never read them. And I just would love to hear you speak about that.
Thank you. That character, I don't want to say too much about who she is at this moment, but she was not intended to be in the novel. I intended her to be off stage, mentioned, acknowledged, but not to have a voice or a presence. And it was pointed out to me by my editor, whom I respect enormously, and someone else from my publishing house, Heather, is here. Hi, give me a shout out. HarperCollins is a wonderful place to have landed, and I feel very lucky that I have. She said, I think you are missing a dramatic opportunity here in not having this character have a voice and be present. And I take her advice very seriously. So I said, okay, I'll think about that. And then I spent a couple of weeks kind of grumpy and stomping around thinking, I don't know who she is. I don't know what she wants. I don't know why she's here. She wasn't supposed to be here. And then in these moments, and not all moments in writing are like this, but this was, and it happens enough to keep you going, which is I literally I hear voices. She was talking to me and telling me who she was and about that baby she lost and how she felt about it and what she was going to do about it. And it is the best feeling I know as a writer, where you feel like you're not creating it, you're transcribing it. Like you are a conduit or a vessel for something else, someone else, like someone has sort of like tapped you and said, on the shoulder very urgently and said, listen to me, listen, I have to tell you something that's really important, and you have to get it down, and you have to get it down right. And that's your job. So you feel it kind of going through you, but not actually yours. And that was how once she started talking to me, she didn't stop.
I just want to mention that isn't it so that you then you wrote the novel again from the beginning? I mean, because she's
pretty
so
much
woven in. That
yep.
I think it's just so great to hear about this work ethic to start like, okay, I'm going to sit down and from scratch re-envision. Like there are parts of the story that are set. And if I remember correctly, the novel was originally set almost entirely in New Orleans.
It was.
To me, as a writer, it's just so fantastic to say I'm going to like throw it back into the take this rigid stuff that's dried out and start all over again, and to be able to
it's demoralizing. I have to say,
what was that?
It was demoralizing.
Demoralizing. I think it's just important to hear that part of the process.
Well, again, this was Emily, my editor, who said in the original version, you're right, most of it took place in New Orleans and in Russia and New York only in the very last chapters. And she said, I feel like the book is coming alive in New York. I think you want to set more of it there. And I sulked and pouted about that for a while too. That seems to be part of my process that I have to, resist a little bit but I have a very good friend, also a writer named Jenny Fields. And during one of these intervals when I was having trouble, I was like whining to her. And she said to me, you just pull up your big girl panties and do it. And I don't know why that worked, but it did. And every time when I got down to work, I'd say, mentally, see, Jenny, I'm doing it. I'm pulling up my big girl panties and I'm doing it.
Is that why you dedicated the book to her?
Yes, actually, that's right. Thank you for.
I was wondering, why is she the person you dedicated the book to?
Well, I've dedicated books to different people, but
that is so.
But I like doing it to someone who's alive rather than someone who isn't. I like to, in sort of departure from the Jewish tradition of naming for a dead relative, I am going to, thank a living person who's actually going to enjoy it. So that's what I did. Yes, she was very helpful to me in that.
Yeah, I always appreciate hearing that from. I just think it's very inspiring when you hear from writers or any artist how they had to go back to the drawing board again, because I think when a piece is done and you read it typeset, it just seems like it all flowed out, easily. And your writing has such velocity that it gives the perhaps mistaken impression that it just, flowed out without a problem, rather than, no, you had to reconceive of it. And I love what you said too about being grumpy, and hearing, a critique like, oh, now you have to reset the whole book in a different place. I've written about the creative process. I think about it a great deal. And I feel like one of the big differences between a professional writer and somebody who isn't is the ability to gather one's spirits up again, to sleep on it, to feel blue, and then to get a new idea that brings the whole thing together.
Right.
And you embody that. One would never know reading your novel that.
Well, I'm glad. Thank you. Writing a novel, and I've written short fiction too, and I love short fiction. I don't know if you're short story readers here, but it's a completely different entity. It's not like one is a stepping stone to the other. And the way a novel exists in time, both reading it and writing it, like I have sat down in my life, had an inspiration for a story, and banged out a draft without getting up, like 25 pages. I'm not saying they're finished and perfect, but like that initial impulse to write them, I could do in a single sitting. You cannot do that with a novel. You just cannot. Like life takes over. You have to eat, you have to sleep, you have to take the dog out in my case. So you have a different relationship to it in time. Like you have to keep leaving it and coming back to it. And that's just, it's neither better nor worse. It's just different. And you have to be able to contend with that. And some of that means needing to revisit things and rewrite things and rethink things, because there's just a longer gestation period here.
Let me ask how, the story, reading it through, it feels very well balanced. It feels, there's almost this feeling of inevitability to where I'm just wondering, how much do you know when you begin about where the story is going to end and how you're going to get there?
That differs from novel to novel, but in this case, not a lot. I thought it was going in a very different place, and there were other sidelines about abortion. Margaret Sanger was a character introduced at the end. I had done some research about her for another project that didn't come to pass, but I was really interested in her life and what she did. And so it was quite different. Very different ending altogether, very different direction. But that I think changes from novel to novel.
Right. Let me see. So what one of the things that struck me in reading the book is how very non-judgmental you were in describing the life in the district. And I'm wondering, how was that for you to choose? Like, how are you going to write it from a woman's perspective about a life of prostitution or a life of being a madam?
I'm glad you asked that, because I have thought a lot about it. And apart from women who were coerced into doing this, forced, and there were many historically, we know that, girls and women who were pushed into this life through no choice of their own. This is a woman who chose to do this. And I look at it less from a moral point of view than like why? Like, what would make you do that? Why would you choose to make this potentially the most intimate and joyful kind of connection with another person? Why would you turn this into a business transaction, into a matter of commerce? And I don't think it's judgmental to say it's not that it's wrong, but to have sex for money, it has to change you inside. It just does. Like, it is going to define you in some way. And I was interested in knowing, well, why? What pushed her into that? What made her do that? And I hope I did a good job of explaining it.
Yeah, and now that you say that, I can see that the way that the character is when we meet her, it has something to do with the past life that she led, the emotional choices she had to make to survive that, which I hadn't. It's a little bit curious. I hadn't seen that before. So I'm wondering, do we have time for a little bit of a reading, or should we take questions?
I will do it. Well, maybe where's our time? I'd love to have some questions too, but it's a short passage, and I read fast. What's that? At 12:35, there's the 10-minute mark. Okay, so that I'm fine with that. Just before I start to read, and I'll just sort of situate you in it, there's a line that B, the character, says, I don't know if she says it aloud or maybe to herself, "We are women to whom harm has been done." And that like kind of sums up my feeling about it. Like, these are women to whom harm has been done. And so they don't regard themselves so highly. They don't value themselves. And in a way, they seek to recapitulate that harm, to repeat it. So the harm that was done gets replayed over and over again in their lives, as prostitutes. That's just my feeling about it. I don't profess to know the definitive answer. So I'll read you a little bit. This character, I've mentioned her, began her life in Russia. She was Yevgenia then. She comes to New York. She comes to New Orleans and renames herself Beatrice, B. And from New Orleans, she leaves and comes to New York. So this is her introduction to New York. B's initial impression of New York was not rosy. In fact, she thought it was an awful city, gray, dreary, filthy. On her very first day in the fabled metropolis, she'd been forced to pick her way through the revolting mess left behind by both horses and dogs, piles of mold-spotted potato skins, rotted lettuce leaves, empty liquor bottles, and the bones of God only knew how many chickens, picked clean. The throngs of people who hurried along the wide avenues appeared dour and in some cases malevolent. The tall, soot-stained buildings seemed to glare down at them. And perhaps worst of all was that New York was so very cold. Bea had spent the first years of her life in Russia, where it had certainly been colder, but the next 3 decades in New Orleans had blunted both her memories of and tolerance for the chill. The biting wind made her eyes tear, her nose run, and sliced through her new coat. It had seemed so fashionable, so chic, back when she'd bought it on Magazine Street, and it offered no better protection than a dressing gown. How had she not anticipated this? Alice seemed to share her revulsion, and though she didn't complain, acted as if she'd been bludgeoned into silence. Bea had spent much of their trip north on the New York and New Orleans Limited, prattling on about landmarks she'd read about but never seen. Central Park, the Plaza Hotel, the New York Public Library, the Metropolitan Opera House. And the train itself bolstered this glamorous, if imaginary, picture gallery. The observation car with its enlarged windows and sweeping panoramic views, the cunningly designed compartments, the single red rose placed in the bud vase that sat on each table in the dining car. But when they found themselves thrust unceremoniously into the pure bedlam of Pennsylvania Station, Bea felt she'd deceived Alice, and her own words mocked her. There were so many people, all rushing, shoving, muttering, scowling. Getting out of the terminal was a challenge, and being outside was even worse, what with the teeming sidewalks and streets choked by automobiles, horse-drawn wagons, and bloated, monstrous buses. After 20 fruitless and freezing minutes trying to hail a taxi, Bea finally succeeded. She'd practically stepped into its path to flag it down. Sitting inside, Alice was clearly terrified. It was the first time she'd ridden in such a vehicle, and she clutched the front seat, alarmed by the speed and the blaring horns of the other motorists around them. When they finally arrived at the hotel on Upper Broadway, they went upstairs, undressed, and went straight to bed. Bea slid down the well of sleep as if drugged, but the next morning she had to face the city again, pulsating, chaotic, more foreign than she ever could have imagined. Maybe it had all been a mistake, the visit to the detective, the knowledge he'd given her, the plan to come north. Her decision was hardly irreversible, though. She and Alice could just turn around and go back. Of course they could. But back to what? Bea knew her life in New Orleans was over, and since she'd adopted Alice in all but a legal way, the girl's life there was over too. Breakfast the next morning was a subdued meal, with Alice answering only in monosyllables. Bea sipped her coffee and ersatz bitter brew and began to devise something like a plan. The hotel was a temporary oasis. Thanks to the detective, Vernou, she'd trained her sights on Brooklyn and a neighborhood called Prospect Heights, where he said Catherine Beryl was living. But even though Bea had the address, she couldn't just show up at the house and announce herself. She had to bide her time and find the right moment. Right moment and right words, too. She'd rehearsed them endlessly in her head, but everything she came up with sounded false, hollow, and thoroughly wrong. On the first morning, though, she had a more immediate concern: how to deal with the cold. She thought of the broad avenues of her home city, its denizens draped in fur and leather, elemental materials with which to face the most brutal elements. The hotel concierge seemed a little puzzled by her request, but consulted a directory and was able to provide the address of a furrier who specialized in secondhand and refurbished garments, whose downtown shop could be reached via the subway at 86th Street. Alice was horrified by the idea of descending underground. She was sure they'd be suffocated or crushed. Bea didn't like the idea either. But millions of people in New York City traveled by subway, and if she and Alice were to become New Yorkers, they at least ought to try. Everyone else is doing it. They don't seem afraid. Maybe they're insane, Alice said as she stood outside the station, or idiots. Bea took her arm and they went carefully down the stairs, avoiding the other people rushing by them. The subway train hurtled into the station almost as soon as they reached the platform, and Alice clapped her hands to her ears. The lurching ride caused her to collide into the woman standing next to her. "So sorry," Bea said to the woman, who glared at Alice with such hostility that Bea put her arm around the girl's shoulders, an instinctive gesture of protection. When the woman exited the train at the next stop, Bea felt something inside her unclench, just a little. She'd get used to it. They both would. The address she sought was only a couple of short blocks from the subway station. After climbing a narrow and splintered flight of stairs, Bea tapped on the frosted glass door, whose block lettering read, "Ned Rappaport, Furrier." A man she assumed to be Rappaport opened it almost immediately, as if he'd been waiting for them. Come in," he said genially. His Russian accent was as thick as her own had once been. Bea looked around the showroom where animal pelts were tacked to the walls, stuffed onto shelves, and piled on every available surface, including the floor. There were also a pair of sewing machines, a battered mannequin, and a metal rack crammed with coats, mostly made of fur, but several of cloth as well. "You'd like to see a fox, maybe?" Rappaport asked, "or a sable? It belonged to a fancy lady, and she only wore it a few times before she dropped dead. May she rest in peace." "No fox," said Bea. "No sable. And I want your best price, since I'm going to be buying 2 furs, 1 for each of us." She gestured toward Alice, now stroking the arm of a leopard jacket. Then she began to look through his merchandise methodically until she found 2 suitable coats that she tried to wrestle from the tightly packed rack. "Let me." Rappaport struggled a moment before he freed them both. "Mink, a good choice. Warm but light. Won't weigh you down. Do you and the young lady want to try them on?" Alice slipped hers on and stood before the dust-streaked mirror. The fur was worn at the cuffs and the pockets. "It's very soft," she said, "but not in such good condition." Bea nodded. The coat she'd selected for herself was even more flawed. There were several slashes in between the pelts, as if someone had gone at them with a knife. "I'll let you have them cheap," Rappaport said eagerly, "for the price of cloth practically." "I'm not done yet." Bea answered him in Yiddish, a language she knew just well enough to construct the simple sentence. Rappaport looked surprised. So did Alice. "Du bist ein Yid?" the furrier asked. "You're a Jew?" In Russia, the answer to that question would have been fraught, but in the United States it was less so, a cause for derision at times, but not a blow to the face, a kick in the groin. Bea nodded and returned to the rack, where she pulled out 2 more coats, one of black wool and the other of camel, both quite large. When Bea asked her to take off the fur and try the camel, Alice seemed disappointed. "The fur would be warmer," she said. "Of course it would. That's why I'm going to ask Mr. Rappaport to use it as a lining." Bea turned to him. "Could you do that?" "You want to buy fur only to hide it?" "Not hide it. Use it in a different way. In this new life, she'd need practicality, not opulence." She handed him Alice's mink so she could try on the black coat. Immediately, she was enveloped by the volume of fabric. Perfect. "You can do the same with this one. Use the other mink to line it, take it in where you need to. The condition of the pelts won't matter, though you'll have to stitch mine back together. And we could use belts." She pulled the coat away from her body so that it formed a tent. "There's enough material here for that, isn't there?" "Plenty," Rappaport said. "Excellent. How soon can you do it?" "Tomorrow, maybe, or the next day for sure." "What about tonight?" "Tonight? I don't know. I'll have to get a helper." "You have 2 machines," Bea pointed out, "and I'll pay you extra." "All right," Rappaport said. "Come back at 8. Once they were out of the shop, Alice asked, What was that language you were speaking back there? That it was. Just then, a passing automobile came dangerously close to Alice, and B yanked her back from the curb, then cautioned her about keeping far back from the traffic in the future. The topic of languages slid away. When they returned to the shop some hours later, Rappaport was ready for them. He was good at what he did. The coats were well-tailored, stylish, and best of all, warm. And since his helper was still there, B bought a moth-eaten jacket and had the woman fashion 2 fur headbands, one for her, one for Alice, that fit snugly around their ears. What a good idea, Rappaport said. I'm going to have Minnie make a few more. I bet I'll sell them all by the end of the week. B looked at Rappaport. You're a good businessman, she said. And you, madam, you're an even better businesswoman. B froze. How could he have known just how apt a statement that was? Was he mocking her? Insulting her? No, she was overwrought, that was all. Of course Ned Rappaport didn't know who she'd been or what she'd done. There was no way he could have. She'd taken the precaution of changing her name, yet again. Now she was Beatrice Jones, just to make doubly sure that her past couldn't catch up with her. And as she ushered Alice out of the shop and back into the darkened but still busy street, she was even more determined to make sure that it never would. Thank you. So that is B's introduction to New York, and I hope you will read more about what happens to her.
So maybe we should take some questions from the audience.
Or comments. Yes.
Comments.
Both are good. Yes? I do. I don't know that I could, sort of describe it in an analytical way. All I can say is that I am not writing for children. I'm writing for the 9-year-old who's still in me. And she's very present. And I have no trouble tapping into her consciousness when I'm trying to write that. And I had an experience once where I'd written a children's book, and when you write a book, you go over it and over it. I mean, you redo it many times, then it's edited, then it's copy edited, then it's typeset. I had read this manuscript dozens of times, but when it finally appeared as a book between 2 covers at my house, I waited till everyone in my family was asleep, and I sat on my couch or kind of snuggled into my couch in a little pool of lamplight, and I read it cover to cover. And I thought, that's a book I would have loved when I was 9 years old. And that was very satisfying. I was still in touch with that person. And I'd written a book that she would have liked. It made me feel very good. So I don't really have a problem. And I usually have a kids thing going with an adult thing so that if one isn't going well, I could turn to the other. And then usually both of them don't go, sour at the same time. So then the confidence I get from something having worked lets me go back to the other thing. And then I feel a little more, like I can do it.
Kitty knows this. I once was at Liebman's Delicatessen up in the Bronx in Riverdale, and there was a little girl sitting there. Her family was waiting to be seated, and the whole family went in, and she was reading one of Kitty's books, and she just kept swinging her legs, reading it like she didn't want. And I was like, oh my God, that's no better compliment.
Right. The young. They're children are like a lovely audience too. I do school visits, sometimes at library visits, and they rush up to you like you're a rock star. And they say, can we hug you? Yeah. Maybe not now, COVID, but anyway, in the past, yes, definitely happy to receive hugs.
So other questions?
I thought I saw one somewhere. No? Okay. I don't bite. Yes, a comment, please. I do, but I think that even though it's become maybe less formal, there's still going to be a lot of attention paid to it. And so people are looking for maybe more comfy things, but still luxurious and, fashionable ones, just maybe, not a pencil skirt right now. Maybe that's sort of moved to the periphery. I think there's a lot in this for us among my sort of hobbies and pastimes. I'm very into vintage clothing, and I look for it all the time, and I purchase it, and I've started selling it a little bit. So I have this friend who's an antique dealer, and he does estates. He does clean outs. So he buys everything when someone has died or moved to a facility, and he takes care of the furniture and the paintings and the jewelry and the objects, but he sends me the clothes to deal with and to sell. So I have had in recent months occasions where I've had like 17 garbage bags full of one woman's clothing in my living room. It is really intense, but really I am looking at her life, how she put herself together, how she moved through the world. And I love to get information about who she was, if I can. And often he knows that because he did the buy. And I feel very respectful and tender when I look through these things. Like, you wore this, and now I want someone else to wear it and enjoy it, or someone else to get use out of it. It's like down a rabbit hole, but a very satisfying rabbit hole. I will tell you about one woman. Her name was Shirley Fader, I guess I can say that. And she lived on 5th Avenue and 60th Street. I think I don't remember the number of the building, but it's the building where Nelson Rockefeller lived in his last years. And it's a rather new building. So he was allowed to break through. There were two adjacent buildings. He was allowed to break through and create a triplex, a very large triplex, where he, in fact, died in the arms of a woman who was not his wife. Yes, we know about that. So Shirley lived in that building. And among the things I found in these many garbage bags were 27 bras. 27 bras. That's a lot of bras. And there's not a big market for secondhand bras. So I'm thinking, and I don't want these to go into the landfill. I just don't. So I'm thinking, and I'm looking, and I Google, and I find an organization that will take the bras. And what will they do with them? They will give them to women who are fleeing domestic violence, or to girls in countries where bras are not so readily available, and they are too self-conscious to go to school or play sports without a bra. Do we remember that period in our lives where we were like this? Like, don't look at me. I washed them all, I packed them up, and I sent them off. And I felt very good thinking, and I had a moment with Shirley in my mind thinking, I hope you will feel good that your bras went to 27 girls and or women who could use them. And these bras will make their lives a little bit easier. They will get through their days a little bit better because they have a bra now, right? So I feel like I want to see the whole story through. So yes, I'm very interested in what my characters wear and how they come to it and what they do with it and what it means to them. Yes? I was familiar with the fur thing, and as I said, my great-grandfather was a tanner, so I knew about that, about skins, and although it was leather and not fur, but something about the process of separating animals from their skins and what becomes of them. So, but the internet is a great tool for a novelist, right? You can find out anything, sometimes more than you need to know. As a matter of fact, you have to not go crazy. I mean, you don't want your novel to seem like you have taken big hunks from Wikipedia and plunked them in the middle, undigested. Not a good outcome. Yes.
Have you ever read the book Mrs. Paris Goes to Paris?
Everyone has been recommending that to me. Yeah. I will.
It just feels like it's very much in the zeitgeist of the whole fashion, and it's absolutely adorable. But it was interesting when you were talking about the whole clothing and wearing comfortable clothes. A lot of times, like when with all the Zoom meetings and you'll wear something really beautiful.
Yes,
on top,
right. And then your gakis on the bottom, right?
But I just wanted to share because you know that I like fashion too.
She does.
And after 6 months of COVID, in the first year of it, and I have a ton of clothes, and I like to collect stuff also. There was this one moment where I was in my bedroom, and I was looking through all the jewelry and the clothes, and I started crying because I thought I don't have anywhere to go anymore.
Right.
Wear any of this stuff, and I don't know if I'm ever going to wear it changed and things have opened up. But one of my friends told me, and I thought this was so true, if you want to dress up just to go walk in the park with your friends, you can absolutely do it. And so I thought to myself, you know what? I'm going to start wearing
Your favorite things. Yes.
clothes. And like, I'm not going to wear stiletto heels,
Right.
you know, to walk around New York City. But I just thought, you know what? There's no reason to subdue yourself if that's your personality.
Right.
You can do it.
I agree.
This should not, you know,
Change that. Or wherever you are. I have a friend that moved to Woodstock, and she said a similar thing. She said, like, all these nice clothes I have, I don't wear them. I said, why not? She said, well, people up here don't. I said, you can. Like, you just decide to do it. That's, you know, that's a personal preference. That's all.
absolutely personal preference.
Yes.
It's so hard to find a dressmaker today.
It is. It is.
My son got married during COVID, and I said, I'm still dressing up. Even though we had a backyard wedding, and brother gave us 50 people, I said, one down.
Of course you do. It's a wedding.
Hard to find a dress.
It is.
Today, my grandfather hosted me from Russia and worked at the IOCWU.
Okay.
And my grandfather was a finisher. And he would make stitches that were so perfect, you couldn't believe it wasn't the sewing machine.
Wow.
He did everything by hand, and he did all the tailoring for families. So he's gone many years, right? And you can't find that.
It's true.
Like who
Right.
for, generally they can do something.
A few things. Right. That's
The process of finding a dressmaker was quite the challenge.
the skills and the cost of it. My grandmother, when she was here, she lived in Detroit, and she was a very dainty, petite woman, and she didn't want, and they didn't have petite sizes then, and she didn't want to wear like girls' clothing, so she'd go to J.L. Hudson and buy her things, and she had a dressmaker come to the house and alter them for her. She was not, I mean, they were comfortable. My grandfather was a window washer and eventually owned his own little window washing company, but she wasn't a rich woman, and she could do that. You know, it's like many of those kind of hand skills. Shoemakers are another one. I think we're more inclined to throw out rather than remake or repair. And so there aren't, and people don't want to go into those trades. Who do you meet that says, oh, I want to be a dressmaker? I mean, maybe they want to be a fashion designer. Like, that's a different thing. But the actual kind of humble craft of dressmaking, you're not finding so many people wanting to do that in like a little shop the way this was, or there would have been many at that time.
Just in the passage you read, I get the sense that you may use Sullivan, for example, as landmarks in the character's lives. To give an example, I remember my next got married 4 years ago. I can tell you down to the tiniest detail how thinking what I wore brings back that whole.
Mm-hmm.
I wonder if you have any sense of how you do that.
It has been a part of me for as long as I can remember. I had a very glamorous and beautiful mother, and I could tell you, like you're saying, not only what she wore in 1964, but the accessories that she had with it. She had a very distinctive style. I admired her enormously. We would go to Loman's in Brooklyn. See, lots of people know that. And you know what that dressing room was like? Like the girls' reformatory. I mean, like those benches and the lighting. It was not like a very glamorous place. And see, I would sit on that bench and watch her and say, oh, mommy, are you going to try on this one? And like touch the dresses. And, you know, she looked so beautiful to me in all of them. And I have vivid memories of what she wore. It's really nice. So yes, I think that for many of us, those things are landmarks. How are we on time? Somebody didn't say another minute or two. Okay, I will leave you with this thought about the power of clothing. So when I was about 3 or 4, I was bought a little outfit. It was like a little tennis outfit. It was white with red piping here and a little pleated skirt and a jacket with piping. And the best of all, on the pocket, there was like a little gold insignia, a pair of crossed tennis rackets. I loved this outfit so much. And then when my father and brother went to the parade grounds to play tennis, I was wearing it and I was brought with them. I was truly surprised that I could not play tennis. I thought that wearing that outfit would automatically, magically confer the skill an ability to play tennis. And I was like, I kind of walked around all day thinking like, oh, really? I thought I could play tennis with them. And I couldn't. So, but that's how invested I was, like in the magic of clothing, is that I thought it could do that for me.
Well, I just want to say you are just an amazing writer, an amazing
Thank you,
storyteller.
Bonnie.
And I understand you're going to be signing copies of books if people
I will.
want to have a minute with you or just to get a signed copy
Okay.
of the book, which is I have to just say, I started it yesterday and I just could not stop reading.
Well, thank
so,
And Bonnie filled in at the very last moment. Somebody else was supposed to, and gave such wonderful shape to this, and I thank you.
great pleasure.
The person who was supposed to do it has COVID. So, thank you. So,
Oh, thank you
Thank
very
you.
much. Thank you.